So,
Yes,
my friend,
yes, Lagdola.
it's
My
such
good
a
friend
great
Gesla.
pleasure
Yes,
to have you here.
thank you.
And I'm sure Professor Thurman needs no introduction in the Tibetan community. And you have dedicated your whole life
That's true.
for education and also, you know, learning Buddhism,
Yes,
teaching Buddhism.
what a pleasure.
Then I consider you as one of the most trusted friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Thank you.
And as His Holiness said during the Mind Life,
Yes,
those who are friend of the Dalai Lama is also friend of Tibetans.
that's true.
So
That's true.
I thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule.
My pleasure.
We in the Library of Tibetan Rocks and Archives, we have been as much as possible trying to, request people who are friends of Tibet
Yes.
and who have been contributing in preserving Tibetan culture and Buddhism. So we, as much as possible, try to collect their life history.
Yes,
So I'm glad that you are
thank
able
you.
to give this time
Yes.
to us. So how long it has been since you first came in acquaintance with the Tibetan people and His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
It's about, well, I became acquainted with Tibetans just about 60 years ago. And before that, I had read some things about Buddhism, and especially Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and especially Tibetan. And when I was a senior at Harvard University, and early in my senior year, I took a infinite leave of absence. I was supposed to write indefinite, and I wrote infinite. And I took infinite leave of absence, and I decided to go to India because I wanted some culture and some teaching that they didn't have in the West. Which the way I expressed it in those days was some kind of a yoga for the emotions, for the mind, how to learn to control your own mind. And I was married at the time. I married quite young, at 18 years of age, with a lovely lady, and had a daughter. And I tried to take them with me for this journey to the east, sort of thing. But they got nervous, didn't want to go. And she was, that wife was nervous, and so we did separate. And then I went, there were no hippies in those days, not yet. It was 1961. And I spent about a year coming through Middle East and all the way to India. But when I got to India in 62, fall of 62, I found Indians didn't really know much about Buddhism. They thought of it as something in Sri Lanka, And then I met some Tibetans who were freshly out. I remember Lokesh Chandra had a place, and I met the lamas there. And I got very excited. And immediately when I met them, I knew they were the ones who had the teaching I was interested in. And actually then Mrs. Bedi, Freda Bedi, gave me a job in Dalhousie.
Dalhousie, yes.
Where I would learn Tibetan and Dharma in exchange for teaching those lamas in her young lama school. But before I went to Dalhousie, I had news from New York that my father had died of heart attack. And so I had to go back for funeral, and I planned to come back to take the job in Dalhousie. But while I was back there, I saw a sign in a Zen center that there was a Geshe-la in the Sokpo community, a Mongolian community in New Jersey. So I went for a visit there thinking they might have friends here and find out. And he said there were some lamas there. And Sherpa and Kamlung and Kunga and Geshe Sopa were there just at the beginning, and he was looking for a teacher there. So when I went there, he said, go back to India, it's okay. And but Geshe Wangyal became my first mentor, like Gewe Shenyan, spiritual friend, like yourself, like a Geshe-la. And then I really fell in love with Tibetan Buddhism. First thing he read me, Shitin Yig, The Friendly Letter to the King by Nagarjuna, commentary by Rendawa. And it was so lovely, it was wonderful. So then I studied a couple of years with him, from late 62 through mid 64, late 64. And then I was so excited about it, I wanted to be a monk. I was going to do lifelong, because it was just heaven for me. And But he didn't want me to be a monk because he said, in the future, it's not your karma, you're not going to be a monk. He said, no, he refused. So, but then toward the end of 64, he said, well, I have to go India to do something with some Mongolian lamas there and help them, they're poor and so on. And he said, I will introduce you to Dalai Lama, maybe he'll make you a monk, he said. So then I got my grandfather to pay me a ticket and so on. So I went to here. And then when he introduced me to His Holiness in the World Fellowship of Buddhists in Sarnath, where he was there giving speech, he says, well, this crazy American boy, he already speaks Tibetan, because I was very quick with the language, and he really wants to be a monk, etc. And please take over his studies, if you will, please, Your Holiness, but don't make him a monk.
Again.
He said, don't do it, because the karma, in my view, he will not be able to remain. You know, there's no support in America. It's American. And His Holiness took notice, but he then, after we became friends, kind of, because then I was like, after Heinrich Harrer, I think I was the second Westerner who could speak Tibetan pretty well.
Yes.
And so when I would ask him question about Buddhism at that time, His Holiness would say, ask Ling Rinpoche or the Khenpo of Namgyal Monastery or whoever the teachers, and then he would talk about general world knowledge, you know, like Sigmund Freud, physics, science. You know, it was the beginning. You know, early '64. He didn't have Mind and Life and this kind of thing. So he downloaded my Harvard, what smattering of education I had in Tibetan.
Wonderful.
And we became good friends, you know. And then he finally did make him monk, and then I was a pain in the neck because I wanted to be more monkey than the monks, you know, monkish than the monks. And I was doing gongche, and I was scolding Daya Rinpoche for eating in the evening. And I was like, I was annoying, you know, because I wanted to be very strict, you know. And then at one point I went back to America. I went to Argentina, actually, with Kyongla Rinpoche. That's on a mission for the Tibetan government. And that didn't really work, to make a settlement in Argentina, but that didn't work. But anyway, then I was there. Then I was studying. I was going to come back and try to be Geshe. And then in America, there was civil rights movement and war protests. All my fellow schoolmates were doing. So I used to go out and march with them with my robes, you know. So in Geshe Wang said, you can't do that in America. You know, you can't be like Vietnamese monk or something, you know. And you either stay here quietly or you leave, you know, and go live at your mother's or something. So then I left, you know, and he was right. And I realized I couldn't really, because at that time, American people thought, who's this weird guy in robes?
Yes.
They didn't have any idea about,
Exactly.
you know, it was just in the 60s, you know.
Exactly.
So then I finally resigned. But I didn't actually, Traba Lokpa, you can't say I just resigned. But then Geshe Wangya refused to take my robes back because he didn't make me a monk.
Yes, exactly.
Said I should mail them to India. And eventually, you know, it all worked out. So then, but then luckily, Geshe Wangya and then my new friend, who has been my wife now for almost 60 years, and my mother, the three of them, ganged up on me. And they said I had to go back to college. And then if I wanted to teach and study Buddhism, I could become professor. So that's what I did then. And I spent 3-4 years doing my PhD. Went back as an undergraduate, finished undergraduate, became PhD, and I've been teaching in the academic setting in the main year. And then I also teach more like Dharma thing in the summer and in special institutions, you know. And it's been a wonderful life doing that. I love that, you know, that's the way you can, it's like the Western monk, is be a professor, although you're actually a layperson. And then I have family. But it's been wonderful to be associated and learn more and more every year about the Dharma. And there's no end to the great learning that's there. And then in American Buddhism, there's this kind of thing where people are really selling meditation, but not learning. You know, Tusam Gomsum, you know, of Sherab. Just the Gom Sherab without the Tuva and the Samba. So then my role in lawless. And so my role has been to sort of insist that the Tuva and the Samba be prefacing, you know, building up to it. Although some of the hardcore meditation people, they say if it's the third floor, then I will just build it on the ground.
Yes, exactly. That's true.
Because they don't really want to learn necessarily. You know? But now, at the beginning, in those days, in the 70s, when I started teaching, and I got my PhD in 72. But then nowadays, then people know that Buddhism involves ethics, involves learning and philosophy, and it's almost like a science, you know, and that's a really good way, you know. So that's my personal history, and then, you know, after I stopped being a monk, I didn't see His Holiness for about 3 years, and but then when I got ready to finish my dissertation, I came here with my wife and 2 children, and I renewed my relationship with Ling Rinpoche, Chapche Ling Rinpoche, and His Holiness, and everyone, and Tara Tulku and I worked together, and my thesis was Lekshe Nimbo, Dage Lekshe Nimbo, and which was Geshe Wangyal's fault. He insisted that I do that. My original Japanese professor wanted me to do Hlaktong Chemo.
Yes, yes.
And Madhyamaka, you know, Tsongkhapa's Madhyamaka.
Yes.
I love Tsongkhapa, you know.
Yes, yes.
He's such a great teacher and a great philosopher, really. The greatest Renaissance man on the planet, I believe, you know. And so then Tara Tulku, Khenpo of Yuta at that time, His Holiness assigned me to work with him. And I did that for my dissertation, you know. But it took me another 10 years to finish the whole. I did some parts of it for the dissertation and a study. It took me 10 years to finish the whole translation. And I love it. It's a wonderful book, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I read that.
You read my central
read
thought.
that, yes.
My original title was Speech of Gold.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know, because usually people say silence is golden
Yeah.
and speech is silver.
Silver.
You know, but the
Speech is
boba,
gold.
the eloquence of
Yeah, yeah,
Tsongkhapa is
exactly.
golden. You know.
Exactly.
That's what I was saying.
So I know that you have written this book, Why the Dalai Lama Matters.
Oh, yes, right.
So
Yes.
So of course everybody knows about the importance of His Holiness Dalai Lama, but I want to hear from you
Okay, sure.
the importance
Well, actually,
of,
yes, I like
His
to,
Holiness.
you know, I'm getting the rights back from that
Yeah,
book.
yeah, and the importance of His Holiness Dalai Lama,
Yes.
and the impact that he has made in
Yes.
today's world.
I might like to republish an Indian edition of that book with you, with the library. I will give it to you. And because, see, that was, in a way, when I did popular books, I have a trilogy of 3 books. One is called Inner Revolution, one is called Infinite Life, and one is called Why the Dalai Lama Matters. Because, you know, Inner Revolution was history from Shakyamuni. Because when I started teaching as professor, I found that Western people had a very wrong idea of Buddhism, especially even scholars and academics who should learn, know better. But they had the idea that Buddhists were all depressed, and they thought samsara was hopeless, and that they should just run away to nirvana as if it was some other place. And also they insisted Buddhists had no ethics, and also because Buddhists didn't have a self, so they didn't even know they existed. and that therefore they had no impact on history and on society. So Inner Revolution was a kind of breakthrough thing, proving that Shakyamuni's movement, you know, the Buddhist movement, was really, I consider it a scientific movement, educational movement, but also it has a religious dimension, of course, a spiritual dimension, and that it was actually revolutionary, but it was in a slow way. It wasn't violent, like overthrowing. In fact, he gave up being the king, but it really changed Indian society. It eroded the caste system, the rigidity of caste system. It brought in a whole, and then with Mahayana, strong energy of compassion, beginning energy of compassion with Theravada and monastic bhikshu thing, but then huge change with Mahayana about 300 or 400 years with Nagarjuna, as Buddha predicted. You know? So that was first one. Then Infinite Life is like a commentary on Shantideva, because when people read Shantideva, they don't really realize the Bodhisattva thing, where you're living in a world where you're going to have many future lives, and you're going to control your own evolution, and you're eventually going to evolve into a higher sort of being, which is still human in some way, but also, and not really divine, not really human, but something special like a Buddha, which is like a super being, really, kind of Superman, actually. And so Infinite Life explained, you know, really make the argument against the no former and future life, you know, really, the karma, you know, the meaning of karma. And at that time, I didn't have a theory I have now, that actually karma is a biological theory. It's not just a religious, mystical thing. It's biological, where the mind is controlling how your body is shaped, and personal, and different from Darwin, like individual evolution, not just a species, you know, and which I think that Western biologists eventually, thanks to His Holiness's intervention, will take seriously. But at the moment they just deny. They think it's just some sort of superstition. But actually they can't, you know, I always say in that book I made the argument that I asked them, you guys only go by what is proven and what you can experience.
Yes. What you
So
can
which
see.
one of you experienced nothingness
Exactly.
and proved that it exists?
Exactly.
When actually nothing means something that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And then they actually think like, who did it? Who found it? They act like nothing, the non-existence that you become when you die, they act as if somebody discovered that. But meanwhile, it has to be an object of blind faith, because no one's going to discover nothing. They know that, because it's not there, right? Anyway, so that's infinite life. And then the proof of the pudding of the Buddhist evolutionary view, Buddhist scientific evolutionary view of life, meaning of life, purpose of life, you know, to be as part of a stream of many lives of evolutionary history toward a most positive summit of evolution, you could say, to become a perfectly wise and perfectly compassionate being, a Buddha. And the Dalai Lama is a proof that that's possible, in a way. And coming from a culture that before Buddhism, before the Buddhist scientists, the Siddhas, the Mahasiddhas like Guru Rinpoche and Shantarakshita, etc., came there, they were conqueror people like Americans with the Pentagon. You know, they conquered everybody around them. The only lucky thing was they didn't want to colonize anybody because they liked living at high altitude in their wonderful land of snows.
Right.
You know? So they would just beat them up and then leave.
Yeah.
But after Buddhism, they became nonviolent, slowly, took time, many generations, and they become the wonderful culture that we have today, the peaceful culture, actually, which suffered for that reason.
So can you?
So that's the why the Dalai Lama matters. And then in the mattering thing, it was an amazing experience to write that book, because I really investigated, had a lot of help from the Dharamsala website about how many people His Holiness has met in the last 40 years since he's been traveling the world, since the 70s. And, you know, like he met Angela Merkel when she was Secretary of Education in an earlier government. He met some person in Costa Rica who later became president. He met, you know, in other words, he's really influenced the world. And then, of course, he got Nobel Peace Prize. I was part of a group that nominated him three times in a row. First 2 times they didn't dare do it because of China, the Norwegian. And finally, third time, China had done bad behavior in Tiananmen Square, so then they didn't mind. They managed to push past the obstruction, and although Chinese tried to pressure them, but they gave him Nobel Peace Prize, which he is the best recipient ever of Nobel Peace Prize. And after that, remember, we all thought that there would be big change in China's behavior, but unfortunately, there was an opening of a few years, with also the Soviet Union withdrawing. It was a wonderful time, early 90s. But then they hardened and they went back to their stupid behavior of trying to pretend Tibet doesn't exist. And so that's where we're still stuck today on the political level. But on the spiritual level, as His Holiness jokingly said yesterday, Chinese are trying to control him, but now they've started to change their rhetoric a little bit, because there are hundreds of millions of Chinese Buddhists who actually love Tibetan Buddhism and they admire His Holiness. Hundreds of thousands have come to India to study with him on and off, and with other lamas as well, and also free Chinese in Singapore and Taiwan and Malaysia and different places like that, and in America. So there's inevitable change. It's just really frustratingly slow, and the problem with Marx's theory is a little bit stupid. It has a good side of pretending they're going to share wealth with everybody, communistically, although they've never been communism, really speaking. But the one really stupid thing is what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because as we are learning, if the world will finally learn the lesson, when you have a dictatorship, it's the dictatorship of the dictatorship. That's it. They don't do for the people. They do for themselves, for their own power, you know. And whether they call themselves communists or fascists, or it's all the same thing. And Mr. Putin is dramatically showing that today, that behavior, and they have a fake argument that such a person is very efficient and effective, and it's democracy is crazy and everybody wastes time and it's very chaotic, but actually the dictator is very inefficient and ends up destroying their own country usually. It takes time, but for example, Hitler, he was going to save Germany, right? But in 13 years, he destroyed the entire country, besides many other people, And Germany was a wasteland after bombed out of existence practically. It only took him 13 years to destroy. Putin took over after Yeltsin, after Gorbachev tried to open Soviet Russia to a decent life. And he's only been going 19 years, and now he's ruining the whole place. It's openly visible. And that will be inevitably the case for a dictatorship. Meanwhile, His Holiness was, of course, doing in exile democracy, and he was showing, and very popular, as he said, in 2011 when he resigned from having political responsibility. And he brilliantly showed that even your popular sort of leader whose final word has the final word, so to speak, he could let go of that power. Even he was so happy. He said, I feel really liberated. And he says, that doesn't mean I'm abandoning my people, but it means that now I'm letting them take the freedom to have the responsibility, which is wonderful. So anyway, I sort of show, because the Western people, since there has been no way of forcing China to let go of Tibet, which they have no right to be controlling. It's still illegal. In international law, you can't just invade and occupy a country and say it's yours, and just because you say so. There has to be a true, free plebiscite of the people to say they want to join somebody. Otherwise, since the UN system, that's it. Not that they really do it well, but that is the system. And so the occupation is still illegal. That's why they're still just trying to destroy Tibetan culture, because they want to sinicize whatever Tibetans are left alive to pretend they were just Chinese. They won't even know Tibetan, they hope, and they'll all speak Chinese, and then they'll just be Chinese, which they've tried out for 70 years, and they've totally failed, because you can't. Even Genghis Khan never tried to change the culture of the Mongolian Empire. He just made commercial connections with everybody, and there was an initial fight when he would overthrow the previous leaders. But he would then, after that, not try to change the culture of the people at all. So, and that had a very successful empire for 300 years, And communist empire is not going to last more than maybe another decade or less, maybe. So anyway, why that dilemma matters is, the argument is, although people think he's impractical as far as social things go, and especially, for example, his theory that politics should be a bodhisattva work. And this idea that you have in the West that, well, politicians are all corrupt, so you just pick the one who's the least damaging, the least harmful, and then you have to just deal with it because they're not going to be honest. And that in a way, legality and ethicality are two different things, and you can be unethical but still legal, and then you can get away with whatever, which is the wrong idea of a Western social system. And His Holiness says no, politicians should be responsible for the people and so on. Like, I love it when the governor of Bihar asked His Holiness to bless Bihar. His Holiness said, well, I sure, but the one who really has to bless it is you, because you're responsible to the people in Bihar, so you have to give your blessing, which I think was really marvelous. So my point is that therefore he's a world leader of all world leaders. And everyone has met him at the time I wrote it, and pretty much, and still I think, except the Chinese leaders, and maybe some. And he was invited frequently to different African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, and Muslim countries. But then Chinese would block visa whenever they could, and they had the money to pay off the leadership, so the people couldn't get to meet His Holiness much in certain places. But otherwise, he'd been all over the world, and he has kindled in the world the idea that, human beings can manage to live sensibly and realistically, because of the fact, I have another slogan I love to repeat, which I love that in your talk, Geshe-la, you said the other day, that it's a matter of knowing reality. It's not a matter of some, impossible mystical idea that Buddha's enlightenment means he knows what is going on in life and what the reality of life is. So I have a kind of story. I say Buddhism is realism. And even I translate Yandakbe Tawa, Yandakbe this, instead of right, as if it's following a rule. Like Wangchuk Chenpo said, so you're right when you follow the rule. In Buddhist ethics, it's realistic. Yandakba means realistic. So a realistic worldview, realistic ethical view, realistic meditation. So I do that. Actually, Alan Wallace used that for a little while, and then he went back to right and wrong. So I got that idea from him, but I argue that. And I think that's a good, because it shows, and especially because one other aspect of His Holiness's leadership that's very important. He has told 3 popes and many religious leaders from other traditions that at this time in history, we should all give up trying to convert each other's followers, because it's dangerous, and everywhere, every city has people from all the religions, and it will create dangerous divisions in people. But some people will become fanatical, and then they will consider the other people, the other religion, less than human, and they'll treat them badly. And so we can learn from each other in the term of method of understanding, method of ethical practice, method of meditational skill, and even insight and analysis about the brain or whatever scientific thing. But but you can sort of culturally stick with your own rituals and Christmas time and whatever. Like in my family, we with children, you can't not do Christmas. Even if you're not really a follower of the Christian church, everyone loves Jesus anyway, who's like a compassion emanation of his own, in his own terms. And so you do that, and we always used to say it's like Shakyamuni in the Chotrul Chenpo, Mönlam Chenpo time, when he planted his toothpick and made a jeweled tree, which everybody saw, and it showed a miracle like that. So that's our Christmas tree. For our children when we grew up. And so you can sort of transplant some things if you learn something from another tradition, but you stay within it. But in my case, I didn't consider myself a Christian, because even as a small child, I considered God, couldn't be omnipotent creator and still be a nice guy, because there's so much trouble, in the world. So I felt it was impractical. And I never heard of shunyata at that time, or emptiness, but I did think of infinity as somehow eroding the certainty of the blind faith that they demanded. So even as a child, I wouldn't accept. And I loved to become a Buddhist monk. So I was converted from nihilism, materialism, you could say, in a way. And but then even His Holiness has taught me maybe to appreciate materialism. That in a way it has helped people come up with the idea of secular pluralism, religious pluralism. Because for that, if you're doomed if you're not a Christian, or you're doomed if you're not a Jew, or you're doomed if you're not a Muslim. And His Holiness once went to Harvard, when he first was coming to America, he told the people at Harvard Divinity School, at that time I was translating, and he said, "Well, I want you all to know I don't believe in God," he says. And I said, "Well, Your Holiness, you don't have to say that right away." I said to the Tibetan, Jeffrey wasn't there, or whoever wasn't there, so I was translating that one. And he said, "No, but I want them to know," he says, and because they might get to like me, and then later they would discover I don't believe in God, and they might faint. But then at that time, he admitted to them that in traditional Buddhism, there is a kind of view, if you don't know Buddha's teaching, then you also can't become liberated, And so he said, we have to give that up. And then he mentioned Thomas Merton, and he mentioned people from other religions who he found some kind of enlightenment in their own tradition. So he truly respected them, which is, that's his second aim in life, as you know. So I deal with all these matters in Why the Dalai Lama Matters, in the sense that the world should listen to him, and even his political things, where he's trying to do something unique, even more difficult than what Gandhi did, which was kind of following principle of nonviolence, liberate India from British colonialism. But in his case, he's trying an international liberation movement of an international invasion without violence, through dialogue and patience. And it's really been many decades of patience, and still continues. And rather than call for violent intervention, And because in the Buddhist ethics, and I used to think there was no justification of any kind of military thing, but then after learning from Samdon Rinpoche at Geshe Jamspel about the Satyavadi, the Bodhisattva Gochara Sutra, about that if you can defend your country and minimize the violence of an invasion, you should, if you're a ruler or you're a Congress or a president or a king, and you push the invader out, and then don't pursue into their country. Make a treaty and tell them don't come back, or we'll get you. But if you can't, if you're too weak and you just do a last stand and drop dead, trying, then actually that will make the occupation more violent, and it'll kill more people, and it's against the Buddhist ethic because it's impractical actually. So I didn't know that for years. I went around saying there was no justification in any case. But then I learned that there could have been a justification. So, for example, presently, Ukrainians are correct to fend off Putin's invasion. It isn't really. Besides which, that one is not really a Russian invasion, because many Russians have Ukrainian wives or husbands, and they're very intermixed, the Ukrainian. But the Ukrainians like to be more free. And from Stalin and even from the Tsars, they often suffered really badly from the rulers of Russia, because they had tremendous agricultural wealth. So the Russian people have no interest in conquering Ukraine, but just the Communist Party, KGB, basically Putin is KGB type. So he wanted to do it to make empire for KGB, go back to old Soviet empire. It's a fantasy. He's living in the 20th century instead of 21st century, and destroying himself and the country actually. So he's proving, which is good, that he's losing, and I admire Biden for doing it, for helping him and the European Union, because he wants to crush democracy everywhere, and he wants just little dictators that would obey him in every country, like Orban in Hungary now. And that won't work, and it would be bad for everybody if we do that. He even basically was behind Trump, in fact, so that's why Trump wouldn't help the Ukrainians, So basically people will come around, and they'll realize that Dalai Lama really matters, because he's giving practical leadership. It isn't some mystical, idealistic thing. It's practical. Democracy is most practical. Even Winston Churchill, who was an aristocrat and like a conservative, and a bad colonialist actually he was, he's responsible for the disaster of splitting India into 3 countries and creating the religious division, arming the religious division that was there with the political element. But Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst possible form of government, except for all the others. All the other ones are even worse, And His Holiness is very much determined about democracy. And that's
so my next interruption is,
yes,
you have been not only ardent follower of Tsongkhapa,
yes,
but also a scholar on Tsongkhapa.
Yes.
You held the chair of Tsongkhapa.
I love Tsongkhapa.
And so I'm dying to hear your.
Well, here I have to give great praise and recommend to everyone Thupten Jimbala's biography of Tsongkhapa, which I am very bad and defective. I did a book called Life and Teachings, where I included a very short one that you all published by Geshe Ngawan Dalge, a little bit of information from Ketubje's short biography of Tsongkhapa. But Thupten Jimba La, he has written a Buddha in the Land of Snow, as he calls it, and it's a wonderful scholarly biography, because he's not just repeating the sort of more religiously pious biographies, but he also looks at the historical circumstances. He researched the letters from this Kagyu person and that other Lama, and I learned from that, which I hadn't realized, that Tsongkhapa's patronage in his life was mostly from Pagmo Drupa Kagyupas. So he was very learned in the Kagyupa tradition, and also, of course, he was very strongly learned in the Sakyapa tradition. And even from Lotat Namkha Gyaltsen, he got some Dzogchen teachings from the Nyingmas. And he just pulled together, he standing on the shoulders, as he himself says in his introduction to the Leikshe Serdeng, the Golden Rosary. He says that he's the Lotawa and the Panditas, he really thanks them. Sakya Pandita, Longchenpa, and the great Kadampas, and Atisha, of course. And but he managed to pull together all the contradictions and the seeming inconsistencies and the main points in the Lamrim Shemo and the Ngagrim Shemo and then all his other commentaries and things, and the ones that also Gyaltsab and Ketub did. He pulled the Dharma into inherited from India, into a Nalanda system, into a wonderful unified system that was extremely effective of giving Tibetans a method of having a happy life and really transforming themselves and creating a mirror and completing the miracle that had begun with Tresong Detse in the imperial period, and then from time of Atisha, the miracle of turning a warlike nation into a nonviolent, enlightened culture, where the highest thing to do was to become somewhat, whatever degree of enlightened you could, and you could sort of say the national investment in people transforming themselves, instead of being invested in a military force, was invested in a monastic body, which is a kind of miracle that the Western historians under sort of Protestant cultures do not understand. Some Catholics they feel competitive about it, but on the other hand, they a little bit can know that the monasticism is a wonderful invention of Shakyamuni Buddhas, which is the one best institutional way of maybe making a culture less violent and diminishing the power of militarism. But in all other countries but Tibet, by the time of Fifth Dalai Lama and so on, Buddhism was only countercultural, because the king would always keep, or the emperor would always keep, a big military. And then the monks would try to make him be nice and peaceful, but sometimes they succeeded, sometimes not. Whereas in Tibet, the seeming contradiction of the fusion, it never really was a fusion, but Sungdel means coordination, you could say, not unification, but coordination. It's not Chusi Chiktu Jungba, it's Sungdel tu Jungba. So there's coordination. But keeping a spiritual purpose as the main purpose of life in the center of a society is the first achievement that we know, but historical. I'm sure there were certain nations in India, small states, that did that earlier. But Tibetan is the first one we know where Buddhism became mainstream, and therefore the culture became nonviolent. And this was hard for Tibet, and some young Tibetans today almost resent Buddhism like young Mongolians do, because in 20th century they got steamrolled by military invasions, Russian and Chinese, but British, Russian, and Chinese, let's say in that order. But they didn't. But nowadays, all the nations in the world have to demilitarize, as His Holiness says, practically speaking, because all of that wealth that goes into useless weapons, nobody can win any wars anymore. War is obsolete for a practical reason, not for spiritual reason, practical, because weapons are too powerful. So therefore, the old purpose of war, which was to beat the army of the neighbor and then make the neighbor's people do something that you wanted them to do, give you some cheaper deal, in grain or whatever it was. But nowadays, the weapons are so powerful, you destroy the whole nation instead. And then they won't do anything except become terrorists, because they don't have anything left to do anything with. So it's like somebody at the beginning of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, some people who were pessimistic were saying, oh, he's got a lot of territory. And I used to say to them, no, he doesn't. He's destroyed a lot of territory, and he has people walking around in the rubble. But it's all destroyed now. It doesn't produce anything, so it has nothing, actually. He's just wrecked lives and land, And that's the nature of war now. So that's why nobody wins them anymore. So the skill and the cultural understandings and the realistic nature of life dictates in the 21st century that governments need to be democratic to take advantage of the talent of all the different people. They need to have heavy education, and militarism, more than just a minimal sort of a little bit policing, is simply a waste. And that money has to be invested in changing the climate and the environment and stopping the pollution and sharing stopping the bad agriculture, destroying the soil and so forth. All kinds of, everybody knows. And imagine there's a thing that the Quakers publish in America, which shows the combined military budgets of all the nations on Earth, and they in little blocks of $100 billion. It's on one sheet of paper like that. I have a copy, but I don't know the name of who printed it. and it's like a 8 by 11 sheet of paper with little blocks of 10 billion or 100 billion or something. And then they say, clean water for everybody on Earth is this little 3 or 4 of them. Replenishing the soil and reversing desertification and planting trillion trees, that much. And it gets nowhere near the amount of money wasted on weapons, that's shown, And so His Holiness' advice, so the Dalai Lama matters because his advice is practical and realistic. As in the heart of all the spiritual tradition were like that. But then sometimes the religious institutions kind of would sell out to the kings or the militaries of the different countries and then bless them to go conquer somebody, like onward Christian soldiers, or have a jihad to convert people to Islam. And the rulers would use religion as a pretext to do violence. But none of the founders of the religions, including Islam, preach violence, actually, in the initial preaching. But later people say, oh, well, he meant this, and now we can go conquer somebody, And
you had you had long association with Tibetan culture.
Yeah, what's that?
You had long association with Tibetan
yes,
culture.
Yes.
So, what is the most memorable thing that you thought you learned from Tibetan culture?
Well, I won't say Momo, but that could be true. But yeah, I really like. Actually, I had I don't have proper memory of any former life. I've had a few flashes. I have had a few flashes, actually. When I went to Mount Kailash, I had my first major sort of remembrance of something. When I, Gangnam, I went around. But when I was in McLeod Ganj in 1964, and I had my first taste of Zampa, I remember, when I was a child, there's different breakfast cereals in America, but there's one called Cheerios. It's actually made of oats, not barley, but it tastes very much like Zampa. And when I was a kid, I would refuse Rice Krispies and Corn Flakes and any kind of cereal except Cheerios. That's the only one I would eat. So when I first tasted Zampa, that's why I like Cheerios. I had that in mind, but I can't really prove it or anything. So that's one thing. And of course, the other thing about Tibetan culture is simply that, the paradoxical, wonderful thing at the heart of His Holiness's great teaching, about which when she goes abroad, he says, my religion is kindness, and that's in the heart of Tibetan culture. And the root of it, of course, is the great scientific discovery of emptiness, which is not spiritual. It is spiritual, but it's also scientific, because without a huge atom-smashing machine like CERN in Switzerland or like the ones in America, discovering that there's no substance in the atom, that material reality dissolves under analysis. And even the tiniest subatomic particle will disappear when you try to take it apart. And therefore, the absolutes that people project into theories of God or some energy, or in the case of modern materialism, into nothingness. They project absoluteness into nothingness, which is insane, actually, but they do. And this projection of absolutism is actually the nature of reality itself. It's what is absolute, non-duality. And therefore, that wisdom, when you know that, you realize that the absolute thing is not to run off into samadhi or to run off to heaven or go to God, but the absolute thing is to be a little bit nicer to the person sitting with you and a little more altruistic and make it a little better. And actually, Priyadarshi taught me this just recently. We gave a talk on his biography at Tibet House, and I didn't know because I lazily had not read Atisha's biography. But apparently when Atisha, Jorje, went to Tibet, he used to say to people when he met them, have you been kind today?
Yes, yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
The Burke told a kanda segre Kuchamze Jebres.
Chana Devo Imbes.
No.
Chana Devo Imbes.
Devo
Imbes.
You may
Chana Simbachibo Imbes.
Semkibo. No. But nice to others. Kind.
Semkibo Imbes, yes.
Devo Imbes.
Semkibo Imbes. Simbachibo Imbes.
Kibo.
Oh, Kibo. Are you mentally happy?
Okay. Oh, good. All right. So I think that's wonderful. It's just like His Holiness.
Not exactly Sembachibo. Sem Sangpo Chungwe.
Sangbo, that's
Oh,
it. Sem
Sem Sangpo
Sangbo Chungwe,
Chungwe.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Sem Sangbo Chungwe, that's
Oh,
right.
that's
So, in other words, His Holiness, therefore, was functioning like Atisha, like Joje, in his kindness to the Western world or the modern world, where this kindness, there's this wrong idea in the modern world, partially because of misunderstanding of Jesus' mission, I believe. And these people don't know that. But you know this crucified Jesus, which you find? But Jesus' mission was to show that even they crucified, he could fly off, you know, he could revive himself. He would conquer death, you know. He was like his Stukdam was such they could do whatever they wanted to his body and he could survive because you couldn't kill love, you know, you couldn't kill kindness. But actually, for the first 300 years of Christianity, they did not worship the crucified Jesus. There was no crucifixes. It was not their big thing. They worshipped what they call Christos Pedagogos, which in Greek, which means Christ the teacher. And the very strong-looking Christ who is teaching the right, you know, love and compassion and turn the other cheek and etc. Love your enemy. And that's what they worshipped. Only once the Romans took over, they showed people the subconscious message of the weakness of compassion and the weakness of kindness. That if you're kind, people will take advantage of you and they'll harm you. And that's too much in the mind of the world. You know, they think the bad guys are stronger is the fantasy that they have. And His Holiness matters because he shows that the good guys are stronger. But in a way, when finally some leader of China, which we had all hoped Xi Jinping would be, because his father knew the young Holiness when he was in China in 1954, and also not only that, but Xi Jinping was born in 1953, so he must have been blessed by His Holiness and the old Panchen Lama when he was 1 year old, because Xi Zhongsheng must have brought him to show off his number one son. But somehow he's now hardened into like Chairman Mao, you know, I don't know, the ghost of Chairman Mao has like seized him. So we're very disappointed, but there'll be somebody else, you know. So there will be a time, and when that person invites His Holiness, and when His Holiness does Kala Chakra for world peace with the Namgyal monks in Tiananmen Square, that's when people will realize how much His Holiness matters, you know.
And I read
that will happen.
I read many of your books.
Those.
And also, you know, the interesting way you use new terms.
Those.
For example, you use the word inner engineering.
Yes, that's right.
And for Lapasum,
yes.
Everybody talks about Lapasum as 3 precepts or 3 trainings.
Yes.
But you call it 3 educations.
Yeah, higher education.
I liked it very much. And
sure.
Today also you mentioned.
Well, you know why they don't translate it as education?
Exactly.
Because the colonial mind that's still there in America and in the Western world is and which is inflicted on Asian countries too since then. But that mind thinks they already learned everything you need to know.
Exactly.
And they already know everything. So why would they need more education from some backward culture?
Exactly.
So but they're happy to be trained to do something, to meditate. So they want to be trained. That's why they do it. And they don't even Shiksha. I think in India, in Hindi, isn't Shiksha still the Department of Education? The word Shiksha.
True.
Right?
Very true. Tri Shiksha.
So Anu Shiksha or Adi Shiksha. Adi Shiksha. Adi means higher, so higher education really.
Yes.
It's Adi Shiksha.
So my question is.
Yes. Yes, please go ahead.
You are not only a scholar, but also a very good translator with this, you know, careful choice of words.
I hope so.
So what would be your guidance, you know, to present or translate the Buddhist books, traditional Buddhist books?
Yes.
When they translate into new language or when they give a talk.
Yes.
You know, what are the things that people should pay special
attention? Well, I think that no one person can say, but I think one thing we should do, and we've never done, because, you know, people still have that Western competitiveness, you know,
yes,
which is really one form of jealousy.
Yes.
You know, it's either contempt, competitiveness, or obsequiousness. You know, Shantideva's 3 levels of jealousy between people. And so translators have been too much like that. Oh, my word, your word, you know, they've been like that. So they never will listen to somebody else's words. But we should actually meet, and people should rationally defend why they choose this word and that word. And And then people will make a good choice, you know. And then we could have like Trisong Tetsen, like the Mahavyutpati, you know, the Jetaktu, whatever it's called in Tibetan. You know, they will make a kind of list that people, with some options, that like, for example, the great Jangya Rinpoche, Rolwe Dorje, he translated Tenjur from Tibetan into Mongolian. And then he wrote a wonderful analysis of terminology from Tibetan. And I don't think he included Sanskrit, a little bit maybe, but maybe he didn't know Sanskrit well. And so they can trace, so he created a new language in Mongolian. And actually, in a way, one problem translators have had, I think, again, having to do with their sense of the superiority of Anglo culture, which instead of the inferiority of it. And by that thing, they have a term in translation theory that you can translate as if you were looking down or looking up. And actually, it was a great Tibetan Lodzawas realized they were looking up. Because they were coming from a militaristic culture, and they were looking at the noble culture of the Buddhists in India, in a way. And by that time, India had become quite much more peaceful without the influence of Buddhism. Even in the Hindu ethic was much more peaceful. And so they felt they were looking up at more civilized thing. So they reflected carefully, and also they didn't have a lot of baggage in the language. They created a kind of almost a new language especially for that Sanskrit knowledge. And so we have to do that, and we have to choose words that are reflective, that we can feel in the way language is, where it's like plants, transplanting something. We're bringing in concepts that didn't exist in English. But for example, people don't like me when I take Tendel, not Tendel or Jungwa, the whole thing, but Tendel by itself, as relativity. And they say, no, you can't do that. That's Einstein's word, relativity. Well, but Einstein took it is Einstein's word, but he took it to a certain distance, and then he got stuck because no mind. You know, speed of light is the absolute, because at that point light disappears. Light is everywhere, you know. So it's sort of the limit of matter. But mind is instantaneous from here to another galaxy, you know, like it goes. And so we're not limited in that way because we have more flexibility of mind than matter, you know. And so I think relativity is perfect. It has, you know, in some future dictionary, they'll have relativity meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, and there'll be Einstein's meaning, you know, special and general theories of relativity. And then they'll have the Buddhist meaning of relativity, which will be Tendel, and the Dongpa Nidan Tenzin Dewe Chigdu Dunchipa. Dunchipa, you know, like Tsongkhapa's great, you know, Tenzin Tupa, you know. So his praise for Buddha of the discovery of relativity as a scientist. Buddha, the super scientist, discovered relativity. And the discovery of relativity meant that being nice to your friend is an absolutely valuable thing. And it's not like, oh, I don't bother that because I'm going off and it's the sky, you know. I'm going to go into, and unfortunately people, modern times have misunderstood many American Western new Buddhists. They've misunderstood shunyata as meaning that the final thing is where you disappear.
Nihilism,
and you leave everybody, abandon everybody, and then you don't feel bad that it's selfish because you abandon yourself too. So I like to say there's this cheap oneness. It's a cheap one, where nobody's home in reality. And they think that's what emptiness means. But actually, emptiness is empty of itself, and therefore emptiness is all of this relativity. So you're one with all of it, and you're also responsible for all the details. Which is Jeda Rinpoche, and Jeda Rinpoche who brought back that great insight of Nagarjuna, Sanjay Kyang, and Shakyatoba, you know, brought it back to life here.
So I have now two more questions.
So relativity would be a good word, and my fellow translators don't like it. They constantly have to insist on dependent origination. Meanwhile, Chandrakirti, in his Prasanapada, he says, well, really, we Madhyamakas, we say dependent non-origination, you know, Tende Majungwa, you know, Tenzin Dewa Majungwa, they say, you know, like the uncreated, you know, Dumaje, you know, Asamskrita, you know. One of the things Shakyamuni said on Enlightened, you know, Sabshi Turtel Ursal Dumaje. So okay, so that's just one example. And if we reason that through, I think people get it. The other one I don't like is paramita doesn't mean perfection. That's Phunsun Sopa. Paraduchimba means going beyond.
Going beyond.
So it should be the transcendences.
Transcendence.
5 transcendences, 6 transcendences, 10 transcendences,
Yes.
right? You know, but they do, you know why they do that? I've finally discovered. Because in Pali there's a parami, which is like a virtue,
Acha.
you know? And so they think that ta is just an abstract suffix,
Acha.
right? So they don't take ita as meaning going, chimba,
Yeah.
a past participle
Yeah,
of
yeah,
going.
yeah.
So paramita, the way Mahayana is, going beyond, right? But that perfection is not going beyond, it's grabbing something, making perfect.
Yes.
But it's a transcendence where you leave,
Yes.
you know, korsamamepa, you know,
korsamamepa.
you don't perceive the three things. So if we reason it eventually, since we're Nalanda, His Holiness is son of Nalanda,
Yes.
and he convene, I hope he will soon convene a Lodawa conference,
Yes.
and everybody really sits down and hashes it out.
Yes,
I think it
yes,
won't be a problem.
Yes.
And they won't think somebody else did it, and
Yes,
oh,
yes.
that's his word. You know,
Yeah, that's-
they'll think that's the reasonable choice.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
The other
So
one,
my-
is,
yeah.
yes, Lord,
Please. Please. Yeah.
what's that?
So this is second last question.
Yes, yes,
With your long association with Tibetans,
yes.
what suggestion or guidance you would like to give to the Tibetans
Yes,
in the areas where Tibetans should be paying more attention
yes,
and where Tibetans should be working harder?
yes. Well, I think what I have usually said, like when I go to Bhutan or when I went in Ladakh and other places, I have always said, and I believe the leadership in Dharamsala follows that principle more than people do. But there's the idea from the older culture that things like shunyata and prasangikas and things like that, tanjawas, that that's not for lay people. That lay people is, you know, ethical things and generosity to the monks and all this kind. Only the monks are really learning that, and not even the nuns. But now that, so that's not good. And then they, like in the young people get like Western education, which is based on materialism, and sometimes, for example, in Bhutan, the popular public education, you know, the government, sanctioned public education, the teachers are mostly from Kerala and mostly Christians, but they're not they don't proselytize Christianity, but they still, Christianity sort of gets along with materialism where it lets it have sway. So their sense of reality is distorted by the modern thing, and they want to just be modern and in an uncritical way. And they're surprised with a hippie who wants to have organic food and something, and they like more chocolate bar or whatever, you know? And they should short-circuit that. And the monk teaching, the high teachings, should not be thought of as impossible to understand. I mean, they're not going to learn long monastic debate necessarily, but they'll get the basic idea of relativity and emptiness, freedom, and the ethics are maybe some realistic thing, not just religiously imposed. And that would give them a sense of defending their culture against the industrial culture, which is not so good. Like, for example, in medicine, the Tibetan medicine interconnected with Ayurveda and with a whole knowledge of Greek, ancient Chinese, you know, amazing system made by the Yutoks, you know, senior and junior, can have a lot of wisdom to share with what I don't call it modern medicine, I call it industrial medicine, which has some great skills and great analysis, but also some very bad treatments and confusions, and actually allows the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry to produce actually harmful things even, and wreck the soil, and, you know, spoil the environment and do many things. So there's a lot of aspects of Tibetan culture which is, people say traditional, but it isn't traditional in an uncritical, unscientific way. It's traditional in a more holistic and more naturalistic way, which we need, because we're out of the Western culture, because of this the madness of making nothingness into God. They are wrecking the planet, you know, it's clear. So there's some confusion there, and we can help with that. So in the education system, Dharamsala has done that, but they've more done sort of Chunjung and things. I don't think they teach You know, they have people read Chandrakirti's Madhyamakavatara, or Shantideva in school. I don't think so, but they could. Kids are not incapable. I have had Tibetan young men and women at my classes in American colleges, and they read not only my translations, other people's translations of some Dharma books, and they, not to be Buddhist, but just as knowledge, and it's very helpful to them, you know. And for example, in philosophy class in an American university, they'll read Socrates or Plato or somebody, and they don't worship Apollo. It doesn't mean they become a Greek pagan, you know. They just look at good thinking, you know. And Indian philosophy, even the non-Buddhist one, is very sharp. Sanskrit thinking is very powerful. And even though we disagree with some of their worldview, we have back and forth debates, it's an ancient conversation. And so that's what I think the Tibetan people could need, you know. In His Holiness's fourth aim in life, I'm working on now myself in America in regard to yogis and Hatha yoga and tantric yoga and so on. And I think our tantric, we have something which I call tantric Abhidharma. We don't use the term, right? Only Asanga used Mahayana Abhidharma. We left it with the Theravada. But we have tantric Abhidharma, which is kind of like subtle body, you know, chakras and the Zalung Tile Sum, and it's like neuroscience of the inner neuroscience. And we should share that with the neuroscientists, and eventually they'll decide that's maybe not just superstition or weird religion, but there's something technical, and it is. And so that I'm not suggesting that should be shared with everybody, but sort of different pride in the Tibetan culture itself, so they don't get the duality between our traditional lamas and the traditional thing is just some sort of superstition, and we're all going to be modern and we're all going to be materialists and so I think that's important, and I like to see that in the textbooks and so on, and I think it will be helpful, you know. I think it would be helpful. That's what I would say, and of course, you know, what can you say? You know, if we're a young Tibetan today in a refugee community or suffering when they'd asked to learn in Tibetan and not Chinese, and then they imprisoned as a, you know, subversive or something, and it's very sad. And you know, one feels very sorry that we're not able to help and stop China and make the Chinese come to their senses. But His Holiness's method of still calling for dialogue, still being patient, not even hating, you know, the bad people who are confused, you know, is a great example. It's a hard example for people you can't really say, you know. And for example, the people who have Rang Lu Putsarre, the Medat Tangbare, Tibetan English people translate that as self-immolation, but they're not immolating themselves. They're just immolating their body. The self is going on to be reborn in some, they know that in some way, but it's very painful and it's horrible, but they're not killing themselves. You can't kill yourself. You're stuck with yourself forever until you're Buddha. And even then you're stuck. Poor Buddha, he doesn't get out of the trouble. In fact, he has to have 1 million bodies to help 1 million people, you know, like Truku, you know, Nirmanakaya. So people think, oh, the samsara is finished. Yes, but you have to go help other people in the samsara, so in a way you're still there, you know, and more than ever. And so they are the heroes, but on the other hand, if they ask should they do that, you say no. You would use your heroism to be patient, because it's not hopeless, because even the worst dictator, horrible person, finally gets the point. Some of them, you know, in the process of being eliminated by the people they've been harming, but they will get the point someday. Everybody does. Everybody has Buddha nature, even Hitler.
So today,
yes,
we had very useful discussion about future collaboration
yes,
between Tibet House and the Library of Tibetan
absolutely,
Archives.
yes,
So before, this is my final kind of question.
yes.
So before you leave, I would like you to recall your association with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives.
Oh yes, well, I was here in 1971 when we were just getting started. I think you inaugurated maybe 70,
yes,
a little before I arrived. I was supposed to be here in 70, but then that time Indira Gandhi and Nixon were fighting, so they were holed up on visa. and I got stuck in Spain, actually. I was supposed to arrive in July, and I would have been here at inauguration, but I didn't get here till November, around November, December. But, and then Gatsola was head at that time, and first head, I think he was first head. And it was wonderful. And then I did that book while I was here doing my PhD. And then, even then, I was trying to be ecumenical with the Lodzawas, because Berzin and Gavin Kilty and various other people had different things, and I didn't change it too much. I wanted to certain terms and things. I had my own view, but I tried not to edit too much their terminologies to show that you can still get there with a variety of things. And the life and teaching of Tsongkhapa I did for the library. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. And the library, I really believe, and it's more since I saw the video about the work of the library, I believe that when His Holiness said at the founding of Tibet House in the 80s that he didn't need a Tibet House in the West because he had one in Dharamsala, he was referring to the library and Tipa, and so all the collection of the culture preserving and culture conserving and culture practicing here in Dharamsala. So Dharamsala is a big Tibet house, bigger than the one in Delhi. This is a big one. And he said in the future he wanted Tibet House in the West to be a resource for all of you, your all great work that you've all done. And before I myself depart to the next life, I like to try to make that happen. You know, I'm working on that. And I think one of the reasons we've just been surviving so far, is that all of the people in the West have more or less each one, or I'm going to save Tibet, I'm going to do something, and they've been competing with the other ones instead of all working together. And I think the greater prosperity of the movement around the world will be, there still will be some kind of competition just to do better, but a competition to cooperate more thoroughly. But I think in a way, if there's something great about Tibetan culture, it's that it helps people learn to be patient with each other, work together, and there's greater prosperity, you know, like the Democrats say in America, better together, you know, build back better together, you know. You can't do it by yourself, you know. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And next spring, I hope to get together the environment people, the mind and life people, science people, the compassion people, and the culture people at Tibet House, and do something here about, because the one thing that Tibetans can be really helpful in the environment movement is, which Al Gore's thing is very, very good and helpful, but one thing that they don't address is how can we get people in the world to be motivated to listen to Greta Thunberg and listen to His Holiness and really make the major changes in the climate emergency that we're having. I don't know if people know that, but it was revealed by research into Dick Cheney's life that the phrase climate warming, global warming, was picked after a focus group as the least alarming. Instead of global overheating or climate crisis, climate emergency, global warming doesn't sound harmful. It sounds like maybe great. It's not so cold, you know. I don't have to wear a sweater, you know. And they picked that to make people, lull them more, the oil company people, to make people feel, oh, maybe it won't really bother me, so they can keep polluting. So actually it's a huge, so warming doesn't sound bad, does it? It's like warming, oh, it's just warm, oh great, you know. Phew, I'm hot, you know. But actually it's overheating, I like to call it, global overheating. And it's very dangerous, of course, to all life. And particularly in the case of Tibet, it's not a political matter about China, illegitimate and internationally illegal occupation of Tibet. It's even an environmental matter. They don't know how to live at high altitude. They don't know how to manage the very fragile ecology of the high altitude. So the overheating in the glaciers in Tibet is 10 times or 6 to 10 times faster than by the normal global warming, which is not normal, but it's also an emergency. But they're intensifying it badly, and so actually their own environmental scientists say so, but the political people don't listen to them, and the business people don't listen to them, and they want to exploit Tibet and minerals, and kicking the nomads off the land is really bad. Getting the yaks who don't destroy the grass and putting too much sheep and goats for wool trade and things, too much, then they bite the grass out, you know, and it becomes a desert. and they have to, that has to stop as an international necessity. And China really, I think the way they could save face, what they must do is the whole of Tibet becomes like an internationally guaranteed peace park, an environmental green park. They have to replant really and protect all the trees they cut down in the eastern area. You know, they can't get into Arunachal and cut down all those trees, which they want to do. They're doing that in Burma, just across the way. And they can't mess up with the headwaters of all the rivers, and they have to regrow all the grass, actually. And and put more yaks and beg the nomads to go back. And now they're spoiling the nomads' hardiness of living in the tent by putting them in a place with some kerosene heater or something, some horrible little concrete shack by a road. And then the children will get, like, they won't have a more tough way of living like that's happened in Bhutan. So they'll have to pay for them to have some heated mobile home or something to follow the yaks around, because the yaks eating and pooping and stomping around can regrow some of the desertified grassland in the eastern part of the Changtang, you know. And they have to do that for the benefit of India, Burma, you know, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, not just them, and themselves. Their own rivers come from there, and Pakistan. This Indus thing is the melting stuff, you know, that terrible flood, you know. And imagine what would happen in India if there's no water between monsoon. It's billions people, multi-billion people catastrophe. But even Al Gore and these people don't really shout, you know, make a loud noise about it, because they're trying to get along with China on local level, you know. So they think their own offices in China will be shut down. Jane Goodall, Al Gore, as good as they are, they don't want to challenge the central government policy, which is the one that's destructive. So that's, we want to make a big noise about that, working with you guys, because you're already bad from China's point of view, so you can say honestly what the story is, and which we want to do.
Well, Bob, you are a storehouse of knowledge, and we can keep on talking, but we can make it a series of interviews.
Okay, I'd be happy.
Yes, because your experience, your knowledge must be shared.
Thank you. And but you know, I love to be here more.
Please.
You know,
please.
I've just always worked so much.
Yes.
And also it's expensive.
Yes, yes.
And so I haven't come as much as I would like.
Yes, yes.
When I see your video here, the great work you've done, many conferences, and also I studied the medicine, and I love Menzikang across the road. And if I'd been here more, it would have been very happy for me. I'm still learning a lot.
So you have this instruction from His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
To live long, live him. So please,
I'll try.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.
And we'll meet again.
Yes, yes. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
I really love your talk too, man.
Thank you.
I love it.